And not only did they become zealous for the law, that even to the point that in Acts chapter 21, 4 of these believing Jews was going to the temple to participate in a voluntary vow that is outlined in Torah, Numbers chapter 6, the Nazirite vow. And the Nazirite vow includes a burnt offering and a sin offering and a fellowship offering, all of which are blood sacrifices. Now, these are the many thousands of Jews who believed who were doing this. This was their practice. That the bigger picture of what was going on in the book of Acts in the New Testament isn't told. We aren't reading it. It's not part of the church's history. The only part of the church history that you know and that you learn is what you read about in the book of Acts, which once we get to the Gentile issue, all of a sudden the Jewish issue disappears from the scene. And that tends to skew our point of view when we look back on what was going on in that time period. The fact that James, the brother of JC, Jude, the brother of JC, the other elders, who certainly included those who were recipients of the message from JC himself, or at the very best from Peter, James, John, and Bartholomew, and all the other guys, Matthew, and all the rest of them, at the very least, they were the recipients of this message, and this resulted in them continuing to observe Torah. And for me, this meant raising the question in my mind of why. Okay, I can see that they're doing it, but I don't understand why they're doing it. Because everything that I'd been taught as a Christian was that the law had been done away with. So why are they doing this? And this is where the next steps in the development took place, because I was still believing in JC as not just as Messiah, but I believed that he was the Son of God. I believed that he was part of the Trinity. I believed that he was divine. I believed he was the perfect God-man, the hypostatic union, whatever you want to call it. I believed that he was born of a virgin. I still believed in the second coming. I was still very much in my replacement theology that the Jewish people still had to come to believe in JC as Messiah in order to be saved, but that God was still going to fulfill his promise because God keeps his promises. Not because they had the truth, and not because their observance of the law was correct, and not because of any other thing, just that God keeps his word, and that's the only reason he's doing it, is just so that he can say he kept his word, because God is a God of his word. Not because they contained truth, not because the Torah was true, not because the Torah was still relevant. But now, all I had in my possession was this notion that these Jews who believed in JC, who actually walked and talked with JC, knew JC clearly better than Paul did. They were still observing Torah. By appearance in the book of Acts, Paul was still observing Torah. I understand we run into a problem when we get into his letters. I'm not worried about that right now. I'm saying, but by his practice, he's still observing the law. So for me, I had to figure out why they were observing the law. Because my theology was that the law is no more. The law is done away with. You know, even if I could look at something in a verse that I knew very well. In Matthew 5, 17, 18, I had the classical Christian response to that, you know, where JC says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you that until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law of the prophets until everything is accomplished." And I always hung everything, as I've heard Christians over and over again do with me, I hung everything on that last phrase, until everything is accomplished. And see, in the Christian mindset, everything being accomplished is what? The crucifixion. That with his death on the cross, he said, "It is finished," or "it is accomplished." Now that his death had taken place, everything was finalized, and The transition came about at that point in time. So at the time that JC said it in the Sermon on the Mount, when he said, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets, well, no, he didn't. But now that it was finished, that period had passed away, and we enter into the age of the church, the age of grace, the age of the Gentiles, whatever you want to call it. And this revelation of Acts 21, that these Jews were still doing this, meant that I had to figure out a new explanation that would make their practice consistent with the rest of the Bible. Because at that point in time, it didn't seem consistent to me. It didn't seem to make sense to me. And unlike some people who had responded to me bringing this up since, when I've said to them, well, why does it say in the New Testament that the Jews who believed in JC became zealous for the law? I've never heard somebody say, well, of course that's the case. The reaction that I always get is that, oh, that's not their Prescott. That's not their Prescott. Then I show it to them, where it's at, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, that's because they were Jews. That's not a good enough explanation. If your theology tells you that the law is done away with, and the faith and practice of these Jews is that they're still keeping the law, they're still participating in sacrifices, and your theology says sacrifices are done away with, then your theology and your practice is different from the theology and the practice of these Jews. So you have to know why, not what you believe, because we all know why you believe what you believe. I know why I believed what I believed as a Christian. I can point to Paul, and I can point out the verses, and I can quote them. Anybody can who's grown up in the church. The question is, why were these Jews doing something different? And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at why would they ever believe something so crazy as to continue to observe Torah in light of the fact that the Messiah came. In light of the fact, in their minds, in their theology, that JC came and fulfilled the prophecies. He came and he died on the cross. Why then were they still sacrificing? Why then were they still following the customs of Moses? Why were they still circumcising their children? Why were these things still in place when JC was supposed to have brought these things to an end? And where we are going to start is we're going to start at the beginning. And we're going to quickly go through Torah. Then we're going to look at the prophets. And after we establish the pattern, then we're going to look at what JC actually said. And if maybe, given what he said, is it in concert with, does it agree with what the Torah and the prophets said? Or does it disagree? And if it agrees, then we understand why these Jews are still doing what they're doing. If it disagrees, then you have to ask yourself the question, well, why in the world were they still doing it? And if it agrees, if their practice is consistent with both the Torah and the prophets and the teachings of JC, then you have to ask yourself the question, why then do you believe what you believe?